As the 2025 F1 season comes to an end and you could say was mostly dominated by McLaren, today we're going to look at what the season would look like without the McLaren drivers. Unbelievably, in this alternative season, 8 out of the 9 teams would score in the first race, with Red Bull, Mercedes, Williams, Aston Martin, Sauber, Ferrari, Alpine and Racing Bulls all scoring points, with Max Verstappen securing the most points by winning the race. George Russell would be second, with Kimi Antonelli in third, securing his first ever F1 podium in his first race. The next race weekend would be the Chinese Grand Prix, where Lewis Hamilton would still go on to win the first sprint of the season. Oscar Piastri would finish second, but in this alternative world, he is removed, so Max Verstappen moves up to second, and George Russell behind Verstappen in fourth would then follow up and move up to third place. For the race itself, George Russell would give Mercedes their first victory of the season, with Max Verstappen followed closely behind. Unbelievably, in P3 would come Esteban Ocon, who recently just signed for Haas and also gave Haas their first ever podium in Formula 1. Moving to Japan now, where Max Verstappen would still take the victory like he did in real life. Leclerc would move up to P2, getting his first podium of the season and Ferrari's first podium of the season, and George Russell would round off the top 3 for Mercedes. 4 races into the season and you might as well call it the Max Verstappen and George Russell show, because so far it has only been those 2 drivers who have been winning the races. George Russell would continue the winning momentum and head into the Bahrain Grand Prix and take the victory. Charles Leclerc would also take a podium for Ferrari, but the bigger news here would be Lewis Hamilton securing his first ever podium for Scuderia Ferrari in P3. This is something we did not get to see in the real life season, unfortunately, because Lewis Hamilton for the first time ever in an F1 season would not score any podiums whatsoever. As we headed to Saudi Arabia, Max Verstappen fired back at George Russell and would take the victory. Charles Leclerc would take another podium for Ferrari in P2, with George Russell staying consistent in the championship and finishing P3. So after 5 rounds of the championship, the standings would look like this. Max Verstappen would lead the way with 112 points, 8 clear of George Russell. There's a 39-point gap behind George to Charles Leclerc in P3, with Antonelli in 4th. Behind Antonelli would be Lewis Hamilton in P5, followed closely behind with Alex Albon in P6. Behind him would be Esteban Ocon, followed by Lance Stroll. Oliver Bearman and Yuki Tsunoda would round off the top 10. The remaining point scorers so far would be Gasly, Hadjar, Hulkenberg, Sainz, Alonso and Lawson, making it 16 drivers out of the possible 19 scoring so far. On the other hand, the team's championship would look like this. Mercedes would lead the pack with 153 points. Red Bull would be 33 points behind them in P2, with Ferrari 8 points behind Red Bull in P3. Williams would lead the midfield pack with 59 points, with Haas behind them with 39. Aston Martin and Racing Bulls were very close for P6, with Alpine and Sauber rounding off the remaining teams. As we headed to Miami, Lewis Hamilton would make it 2 out of 2 sprint races so far this season, as he would take the sprint for the first race of the Miami weekend. George Russell would finish closely behind in P2, keeping his championship hopes alive very early on, as he would eat into Max Verstappen's championship lead. If you thought it was crazy seeing Esteban Ocon finish P3 in the Chinese Grand Prix, as well as it's not the official result, Lance Stroll would round off the top 3 for Aston Martin. But the surprises wouldn't end there, because the race itself would see George Russell once again take a victory in this season. Max Verstappen, his championship rival, would be P2. This would also mean George Russell would take the lead off the Drivers' Championship, but the biggest surprise out of the lot would be Alex Albon securing a podium for Williams, also giving the team their first podium since Spa 2021. Heading to Imola now, where Max Verstappen would win the Grand Prix from Lewis Hamilton getting his second podium for Ferrari and his second of the season. Another driver getting their second of the season would surprisingly be Alex Albon, who would take P3, and a back-to-back podium for Williams. It would be a second consecutive home victory for Charles Leclerc in Monaco, as he would go on to win the Monaco Grand Prix once again. Max Verstappen for Red Bull would finish second, with Lewis Hamilton finishing P3 once again, giving himself a first back-to-back podium of the season. Round 9 was up next, and it would be at the Circuit de Barcelona de Catalunya in Spain, where Charles Leclerc would take a back-to-back victory for Ferrari, taking his second Grand Prix win of the season. George Russell would be in P2 for Mercedes, and for the first time ever, Nico Hulkenberg would take his first Formula 1 podium, securing his first ever podium 3 races earlier than what he would do in the real life season. Canada's top 3 in real life would remain exactly how they would be in this alternative world, where George Russell would still take the victory for Max Verstappen and Kimi Antonelli. 10 rounds into the championship and Max Verstappen would still be leading the way. He would be 4 points ahead of George Russell, and it really seemed to be like this season was turning out to be a Verstappen versus Russell fight. Leclerc would still be in P3 with his teammate Lewis Hamilton 30 points behind him. Antonelli would round off the top 5, with Alexander Albon actually catching Kimi Antonelli and trying to get into the top 5 from this championship for Williams. Hadjar would move up 5 places to P7 after a good few results there, with Esteban Ocon moving down 1 in P8. Hulkenberg would also be a big mover in P9, moving up 4 places, along with Carlos Sainz doing the same, moving up 4 places and going to 10th. The remaining point scorers would be Gasly, Stroll, Tsunoda, Alonso, Behrman, Lawson and Bortoleto. This now makes it only 2 more drivers yet to score on the 2025 grid, that being Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto. But Jack Doohan won't have any chance to score any more points anyway because he is no longer part of the season, as he was dropped for Franco Colapinto at Alpine in Imola. For the team standings, it was a two-way fight as Mercedes and Ferrari were only separated by 4 points. Red Bull rounded off the top 3 with 217, with Williams still leading that midfield pack in P4. It would be then Racing Bulls followed by Haas, Aston Martin, Sauber and Alpine still remaining at the bottom. Austria would see a 1-2 for Ferrari, with Charles Leclerc taking his 3rd victory of the season and Lewis Hamilton securing another podium once again for the Scuderia. George Russell would round off the top 3 for Mercedes, and just behind George Russell in P4 would be Liam Lawson, just missing out on his first ever Formula 1 podium. The 3 race winners of 2025 so far would then become 4, because Nico Hulkenberg would not only secure his 2nd ever Formula 1 podium, but he would now become a Formula 1 winner, taking his first ever victory in the sport, and giving Sauber their 2nd victory in the sport, their first since Robert Kubica in Canada 2008. Lewis Hamilton would make the British fans happy, as he would make sure a British driver would be on the podium as he finished P2 once again, with Max Verstappen rounded off the podium, with Pierre Gasly very close behind, just missing out on a podium for Alpine. Max Verstappen would become the 2nd different sprint winner, as he would win the 3rd sprint of the season in Belgium. Behind him would be Charles Leclerc, with once again Esteban Ocon for Haas getting another P3. In the race itself, Charles Leclerc would take yet another victory for Ferrari in 2025, his 4th of the season. Max Verstappen would be behind him in P2, with George Russell rounding off the podium in P3. Alex Albon once again for Williams doing a cracking job and just narrowly missing out on another podium for Williams this season. George Russell would take the top step once again as he won the Hungarian Grand Prix, with Charles Leclerc taking yet another podium for Ferrari. And at the age of 44, Fernando Alonso would take his and Aston Martin's first podium since Brazil 2023. As we headed to Max Verstappen's home race, he'd definitely make the fans happy because he would take the victory at the Dutch Grand Prix. We also welcomed a brand new podium sitter in Isaac Hadjar for Racing Bulls in P2. George Russell would keep the championship alive as he would take the final podium position for Mercedes in P3. With very close battles behind, Alex Albon just missed out on another podium for Williams, taking P4. As we were heading into the second half of the season, George Russell would be leading the championship now by only 1 point from Max Verstappen. Leclerc remained 3rd with Hamilton P4. Albon now would take over P5 in the championship, getting ahead of Antonelli and was 12 points ahead of him. Kimi Antonelli would be P6 with Isaac Hadjar P7. Closely behind him would be Nico Hulkenberg in P8, with Fernando Alonso over a good few races and going up to P9. Lance Stroll would round off the top 10 for Aston Martin, and the rest of the point scorers would be Ocon, Gasly, Lawson, Sainz, Behrman, Bortoleto, Tsunoda and Colapinto, who would secure his first point at the Dutch Grand Prix, which means now every driver on that current grid would have scored points, minus Jack Doohan. Ferrari were leading the way in the Constructors' battle with 389 points, 40 points clear of Mercedes. Ferrari looked to be in a very much good position to take their first Constructors since 2008. Red Bull still held on to P3 and were still in contention if anything bad happened to the front two. Williams were P4 with Racing Bulls in P5. Aston Martin were closely behind them in P6 with Sauber P7. Behind them would be Haas, and then Alpine rounding off the rest of the teams at the bottom of the grid. With George Russell leading the championship by 1 point after 15 rounds, Max Verstappen would fire back at the next Grand Prix at Monza, where he would take the Grand Prix victory and secure 25 points. Leclerc would take P2 and secure 18 points for Ferrari, followed by George Russell, who would take P3. This would also mean the championship would swap hands once again, and Max Verstappen would retake the lead of the Drivers' Championship, which was now at 9 points between Max and George. Just like what we saw in the real-life Azerbaijan Grand Prix, Max Verstappen would go on to take the victory. George Russell would secure P2 for Mercedes, and Carlos Sainz would make sure both Williams score a podium in 2025, as he would take his first podium of the season. This meant that Williams would have scored 4 podiums in 2025 so far. Heading over to Singapore now, where George Russell would take the victory for Mercedes. Max Verstappen would be P2, with Kimi Antonelli rounding off the top 3. It was also a good result for Fernando Alonso and the Aston Martin, who got P5 for them, and Oliver Behrman scored more points for Haas. Heading to the US Sprint weekend, Max Verstappen would do exactly like what he did in real life and secure the max amount of points you could get for that weekend, with the Sprint and the Grand Prix, winning the Sprint and winning the race. It was another great weekend for Williams, as Carlos Sainz in the Sprint would still finish P3 like he did in real life. Ferrari would get a double podium in the race, with Leclerc in second and Lewis Hamilton in P3. And it would finally be a good result for Yuki Tsunoda, as he would finish in the top 5 for Red Bull in the main race. Mexico would see Charles Leclerc return to the top step of the podium for Ferrari. He would win the Mexico City Grand Prix from Max Verstappen. But just like we've had so many other surprises in this season so far, and here's another for you, Oliver Behrman would make his way into the top 5 youngest F1 podium setters of all time, because he would take P3 for Haas, giving Haas their second ever podium and second of the season, and Oliver Behrman securing his first ever Formula 1 podium. So another great surprise to see Haas up there once again. 20 rounds into the championship and with only 4 left to go, Max Verstappen would take over the lead of the championship and extend his lead to over 31 points to George Russell. Leclerc would still be P3 with Lewis Hamilton behind him in P4. Kimi Antonelli had a good few races and jumped back up to P5 in the championship. Alex Albon would be P6 with Isaac Hadjar P7. Fernando Alonso and Nico Hülkenberg had the same amount of points, and they were fighting over 8th and 9th, with Carlos Sainz rounding off the top 10. Out of the top 10 would be Oliver Behrman, Esteban Ocon, Lance Stroll, Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda, Pierre Gasly, Bortoletto and Colapinto. Ferrari still led the Constructors' Championship, 42 points clear of Mercedes. Red Bull were starting to come back into it, but were still a long way off taking that top spot from Ferrari. Williams have been in P4 most of this season, and it looks like they're still in good position to keep that place. It seemed to be a 4-way fight for P5 in the Constructors between Racing Bulls, Aston Martin, Haas and Sauber, and a long way behind them would be Alpine. It seems to be that Kimi Antonelli has a favourite track because as we headed to the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend, he would win the sprint and win his first ever Formula 1 race for Mercedes. In the sprint it would be a 1-2 for Mercedes, but in the race unfortunately they could not convert that into a 1-2 because it ended up being a 1-3, with Max Verstappen splitting the Mercedes in the race, finishing second. Oliver Behrman drove a fantastic race and he finished P4 in the Grand Prix, nearly getting his second consecutive podium. All teams got a good share of points that weekend, with Alpine, Sauber, Racing Bulls, Aston Martin etc. all in the mid-pack scoring a good amount of points between the Grand Prix and the sprint. The big change after the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend would be Mercedes retaking the lead off the Constructors' Championship. Both drivers did fantastic in the sprint and the Grand Prix, meaning they are now 5 points clear of Ferrari. Red Bull will be 80 points behind them and look to be like they're in a position to secure 3rd place in the Constructors. Williams still remain P4 with Racing Bulls P5. Haas would be P6 and Aston Martin would be P7. Sauber would be P8. Alpine would finally get some points this weekend thanks to Pierre Gasly scoring 4 points for their team, but unfortunately for them, they're 79 points behind the next position in the championship, which is Sauber. Now, crazy enough, the results of the real-life Las Vegas Grand Prix would be exactly the same in this alternative season. This being both McLarens get disqualified from the Las Vegas Grand Prix, giving you this top 10 order, which was Verstappen, Russell, Kimi Antonelli, Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, Isaac Hadjar, Nico Hülkenberg, Lewis Hamilton, Esteban Ocon and Oliver Behrman. So the results don't change, but what does this do to the championship? After 22 rounds of this championship, Max Verstappen looked to be on the verge of securing his 5th World Championship. He could do so at the next Grand Prix at Qatar. George Russell would be on 395 points, while Charles Leclerc would secure P3 in this year's championship. Leclerc could not catch Russell in the final few races to get P2, nor could Hamilton catch Leclerc, who was in P4. Antonelli was still trying to hunt down Hamilton in the final few races to get P4 in the championship. He would be a further 43 points behind him. Albon looked to be securing P6 at this point, but Isaac Hadjar wasn't too far behind in P7 with 91. Hülkenberg with 84, Alonso with 76, and Carlos Sainz with a good weekend would move up to P10 in the championship championship. Mercedes extended their championship lead to Ferrari by 22 points, giving himself a good buffer going into the final few races, while the remaining teams stayed in exactly the same position as they did before. George Russell would win the first Grand Prix of the Qatar weekend as he would take P1. Max Verstappen would take P2, and surprisingly his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, with his best result of the season, would take P3, making it a 2-3 for Red Bull in the sprint. Antonelli would be behind him, with Fernando Alonso in P5. Carlos Sainz would be P6, Isaac Hadjar P7, and Alex Albon would get the final point in P8. The rounding off the top 10 would be Gabriel Bortoleto and Oliver Bearman. In the main race though, Max Verstappen would take the victory, with Carlos Sainz yet again secured another podium for Williams. This would be a big boost for him, and this would also move him up in the Drivers' Championship. Kimi Antonelli would be the best Mercedes in P3, with George Russell behind him in P4. Fernando Alonso, like he did in the sprint race, would get P5, with Charles Leclerc behind him in P6. Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda, Alex Albon and Lewis Hamilton would be the remaining drivers to round off the top 10. So unlike the real world where we did get a three-way championship fight going to the last race, this would not happen in the alternative world, as Max Verstappen had a great weekend and managed to secure his 5th world championship. Along that, George Russell would also secure 2nd in the championship, with Charles Leclerc securing 3rd, which he did at the last race. Antonelli could still mathematically beat Lewis Hamilton in the championship for P4, but he would have to win the race if he wanted to do so. Albon would secure P6 for Williams, and also this would be his highest position he'd ever finished in an F1 World Championship. Hadjar was on 97 points, but Carlos Sainz was on the hunt, and after a great weekend for him, he was closing the gap to Hadjar, and it looked to be a three-way fight for P7 between Hadjar, Sainz and Alonso. Hulkenberg had lost out from that weekend and dropped down 2 places and rounded off the top 10 of the standings. Max Verstappen wouldn't be the only world champion that weekend, because Mercedes would secure their 9th Constructors' Championship, their first since 2021. Ferrari and Red Bull continued their battle as it was heading into the final race, and Williams would secure a 4th place finish in the Constructors' Championship. This would be their best result since 2015. Racing Bulls followed next, while Aston Martin and Haas was behind them, but Haas was very close to Aston Martin, so we could have a battle on here for P6. And that battle would take place at Abu Dhabi in the final Grand Prix of this year's championship, where Max Verstappen would round off the season on a high with another victory in 2025, finishing this year's championship on 11 victories. Charles Leclerc would take another podium for Ferrari, and George Russell once again on the podium in P3 for Mercedes. Fernando Alonso narrowly missing out for another podium for Aston Martin in P4, and Esteban Ocon was behind him in P5, followed by Lewis Hamilton, Nico Hulkenberg, Lance Stroll, who finally got some good results after a good while not being in the points. Bortoleto and Bearman rounded off the top 10. So here are your final point standings of 2025 without the McLaren drivers. Verstappen would take the championship by a hefty margin in the second half of the season, after it being a very close fight between him and Russell in the first half of the season. Most of the championship stayed the same in the second half, with Verstappen, Russell, Leclerc, Hamilton, Antonelli, Albon all staying about the same position as what they were in the first half of the season, the top 6 that is. After a good few races for Fernando Alonso, he would win out in that very close battle for P7 against Hadjar, Sainz and Hulkenberg. Bearman was in P11 in the first car out of the top 10, with Lawson behind him. Ocon would be 1 point behind Lawson in 13th, with Tsunoda a further 6 points back. Stroll would follow next alongside Gasly. Bortoleto and Colapinto was the remaining points finishers. And obviously Jack Doohan, who only done so many races in 2025, never scored at all, so he was the only driver on this year's grid not to score. The team standings was mostly decided after the last race, but here is your final results for all the teams. Mercedes would win their 9th Constructors' Championship, with Ferrari a further 42 points behind them. Red Bull did well to hang on in there and still have a chance of winning, but unfortunately with Max being at the front all the time and his teammates being out of the points, the Constructors was not possible in this year's championship. Williams did fantastic to take P4 and had a good lead over Racing Bulls. Aston Martin closed massively into Racing Bulls' P5 position in the final few races, but just missed out there and took P6. Haas wasn't too far behind them with 152 points, and near was Sal with 135. And unfortunately for Alpine, just like it has been all season, they rounded off the bottom of the teams with only 42 points in P9. In this alternative season, we would actually see 12 podium finishers. That would make it 12 out of the 19 possible drivers taking part of this season stepping foot on the podium. We would also see 5 different drivers win a race in 2025, with Max Verstappen coming out on top with 11 victories. George Russell would have 6th, with Charles Leclerc with 5. Nico Hulkenberg and Antonelli would be tied there with only 1 victory, but it was still good to see another team win, especially Sauber. Just like Max had the most Grand Prix wins, he also had the most pole positions in this year's championship. He had 14 compared to Charles Leclerc's 6, who was in 2nd. George Russell would have 3, and Kimi Antonelli would make it 4 different drivers in P4 with 1 pole position. Sprint wins wins, on the other hand, would see a little bit of a different result, but similar names. This time Lewis Hamilton getting the most sprint wins, but you could say joint sprint wins with Max Verstappen, but because Lewis Hamilton won 2 first, he is then declared the winner of the most sprint wins. Max Verstappen would have 2, Kimi Antonelli would win a sprint race before George Russell, but both Mercedes did win in the end, meaning they both had 1 each. And on the other hand, for sprint poles, Max Verstappen would be at the top with 2, joint with Kimi Antonelli. Lewis Hamilton would take 1, with George Russell also taking 1. So there you go guys, there is what your 2025 Formula 1 World Championship would look like without the McLaren drivers. I originally was going to take the top 3 out of this championship, but considering it was a close championship to begin with, I just wanted to see how Max Verstappen came back in the second half of the season. So it was quite a good season either way, even if it wasn't as close as it was in real life. Thank you so much for watching this video guys. Subscribe to the channel if you're new to help me reach my current goal of 150,000 subscribers. And if you like content like this, because more is coming throughout the winter period on the build up to 2026 F1 season. It's going to be very exciting guys, so you don't want to miss it. Comment below if you want me to do this for more F1 seasons. I'll maybe do this throughout the winter period because we have 90 days until the start of the 2026 F1 season, so I will take suggestions and I'll potentially make this into a series. Okay, that's it from me now guys, take care and I'll see you in my next video.